people can understand. Now, he's written for a whole variety of different publications and even spent time in East Timor talking about or writing about some of the events in East Timor, Rolling Stone magazine, GQ magazine, a whole variety of magazines, but he keeps being drawn back to technology, and that's great for the whole technology field because it's fantastic when we have high-quality journalists who want to actually speak about technology, because the more we can get the average person, the more we can get the entire community to understand about technology, I think the more that this country will progress from a technology perspective. So please make him welcome. I'm excited to see Brad Howarth here in Dubbo.
Thanks. Thanks everyone for sticking around. I need to inform you, I know it's not the biggest room I've ever played, but it's certainly not the smallest. I did a conference some time back, and it was after lunch, and I've come into the room, and there's one person sitting in the audience that, oh, crikey. So we waited 5 minutes. No, there was still one person sitting in there. I thought, well, this person stuck around and wants to hear the presentation. So I went ahead and delivered it. And at the end, I said, are there any questions? He said, yeah, I've got one. I've gone, what's that? He said, would you mind sticking around? I'm the next speaker. So thank you all for sticking around and hearing me this morning. And we do have a number of great speakers coming up for you throughout the day. Stick around. Those of you that are here are really getting a leg up, I think, on not just those that aren't. And some of them will be listening in via electronic means. But you're also getting a leg up not only on people around Australia, but people around other parts of the world. Because some of the information you've been hearing today and heard yesterday is, I hope, going to do a lot to help you when it comes to navigating your way through a series of changes which are going to be pretty fundamental to the way that we live our lives and conduct business here in Australia moving forward over the next 1, 2, 5, 10, 20 or 50 years. So my job, I guess, as a journalist, I spend my life asking questions. And I've been doing that since about 1995. I fell into technology journalism somewhat by accident. But I did so at a point in time where we had this thing called the internet that was starting to emerge. And back in 1995, my first business card did not have an email address on it. It had a fax number instead. And we used to get press releases via fax. And you'd sort of be sitting there waiting for the fax to tell you what was happening out in the world. For most of us in the room who are sort of age 35 or older, you'll probably have been in a similar situation. Now it's almost impossible to find a business card that doesn't have an email address on it. But we kind of forget how quickly the world has evolved, because that was only 1995. That's less than 20 years ago, by which time one form of communication was pretty much completely outmoded another one. Most of my communication to the world now is electronic, and that's something I wasn't doing when I started out professionally. There was an event that happened recently that really threw into sharp relief exactly how dependent we've become on this thing we call the digital economy. Just as an aside, who here thinks they understand what this digital economy term actually means? I see hands shooting up all across the room. Not. If you want to know what the digital economy is, every time you buy something on eBay, that is the digital economy in action. Every time you exchange information via email, that is the digital economy in action. Every time you consume information from a website, that is the digital economy in action. When you hand over $7.50 for a beer at the pub in cash, that is not the digital economy. Basically, everything else that runs via electronic means is the digital economy. And in a way, it's actually a term that's probably going to cease to exist 5 years from now, because it will just simply be the economy. All right. The importance of the digital economy was really thrown into very sharp relief in a very graphic manner late last year in this place. This is Warrnambool down in Victoria. Now, if you've not been down there, it's lovely. It's at the end of the Great Ocean Road. Nice little town, seaside, great camping spot. If you ever think about heading down that way, definitely check it out. But what happened in Warrnambool was this. This was the Telstra exchange. It caught fire. It caught fire in a fairly significant manner. And what was important is this was known as a parent exchange. A lot of the regional exchanges around Warrnambool were dependent on this exchange being in operation to be able to function. So when this got burnt out fairly effectively by an overnight fire on about the 21st of November last year, it took down communications, email, internet, phone, mobile, all across the Warrnambool region and several hundred kilometres out from there. And it was interesting talking to people in Warrnambool about what their experience was, and I got talking to one chap who was a farm manager. And he told me about his regular day would mean he'd get up at 5, he'd shower, have breakfast, and by 5:30 he'd be sending instructions via email to the other farms that he managed in the area. So he jumped online, internet wasn't working. It wasn't the first time that's happened, so he thought, I'll try and figure out what's going on. So he reached for his mobile phone. Internet with his mobile phone wasn't working either. Actually, nor was his ability to call anybody on his mobile phone. Well, that's a little bit odd, so he thought, I'll actually go into the kitchen and pick up the landline and try calling somebody. That wasn't working either. So clearly there was a major problem. So what did he do? He turned to radio, good old 100-year-old technology, and turned on the news bulletin and heard, yes, there'd been a fire in Warrnambool's Telstra exchange, which had taken down communications. If he'd been on Optus, he might have been all right, but he was on Telstra, so he wasn't in this case. He thought, well, that's a bit of a bugger, so he's took 20k out of Warrnambool, better get in my car and drive into town and get some work done. Got in his car, got about halfway, realised he was about to run out of fuel, so pulled into a service station, fueled up his ute, went to pay for it by credit card, and of course the credit card system wasn't working either because that was dependent on the phone system, which had gone down. So wrote an IOU to the service station manager, drove into town, thought I'll get some cash out. Of course the ATMs weren't working either. So waited until 9 o'clock and like everybody else queued up in this queue and waited about an hour to be able to go to the bank manager, hand over his licence and his credit card to show his ID, to which they handed him $100 and took an IOU from him as well. And this is just incredible to show how massively dependent we have become on this infrastructure in a relatively short period of time. And it was interesting talking to people in Warrnambool about what it was like. They got the mobile phones up relatively quickly. They got the landlines up, the mobile phones. The internet took about 2 weeks to get up in total. And a lot of people who are my age or older thought, it was great. No Facebook. Kids actually have to talk to you now at dinner time. And, you know, you've got to go and visit people if you want to find something out. It wasn't like you to send them an email. We had to get in our cars and go and visit each other. And that was fun for about a day until businesses realised they couldn't access their websites. The local hotels where people had been booking online from Melbourne had people turning up, guests who paid their money, but there was no record of them actually having booked. Other companies that were selling online couldn't actually take orders anymore, so they immediately started losing money. Telstra itself has been paying out hundreds of thousands of dollars to these businesses for the impact that losing the internet has had to them. And for the people of Warrnambool, it showed them very, very clearly how dependent they've become on this infrastructure. Because all of the simple stuff that you might be doing at the moment, which is sending tweets or checking online banking or bidding for things on eBay or playing Angry Birds, none of these people could do. And for those of you that might be sitting there using a smartphone at the moment to send a tweet, remember that's something you couldn't do 5 or 6 years ago. But for many of us, it's become part of our daily lives now. It's something we've basically taken for granted. It's caused a significant rethink in the way that we architect our services now, because a lot of people in Warrnambool are thinking, what would we do if this happened again? I don't know if there'd be blood in the streets, I don't know if we'd have a revolution, but certainly you would see some fairly agitated people running around shaking their fists in the air. And it was interesting listening to Peter's presentation before, because he used the word revolution a lot. And I tend to agree with him. I think what we're actually living through here is a revolution. It's not of this nature. Hopefully no one's going to get their head lopped off with the guillotine. But it's a revolution much more in the manner that the Industrial Revolution was to the people of Europe back in the 17th century. And for those of people that were living through the Industrial Revolution at the time, they probably didn't realise how significant the mechanisation of industry actually was. And it took about 100 years for people to be able to really identify it and to give it that term, the Industrial Revolution. And I suspect what we're living at the moment might be called something more akin to the Digital Revolution. Because we're right in the thick of it, maybe we just don't appreciate it right now. But it is having significant impact already. And what I want to talk to you about in this presentation, whereas Peter didn't leave me a lot of room to work with, unfortunately, but he spent a lot of time talking about the future. My presentation now, I want to talk to you very much about the present. Because one thing I've learned about Australians is when I start talking about the future, people tend to tune out a little bit. How many of you did your Christmas shopping in December? Most of you? Come on, be honest. How many of you did it in the week before Christmas? Yet you had all year and you knew it was coming and still you did nothing about it. Even more worrying is the fact that most of us probably don't have enough superannuation to retire on successfully either, but let's leave that one aside. So I want to talk to you about the present, because this revolution is happening everywhere. It's not just happening in Sydney or Melbourne or Dubbo. This digital revolution that we're talking about is currently happening everywhere in the world simultaneously. The Industrial Revolution took about 100 to 150 years to touch the whole world. This one is touching everybody simultaneously. There are already close to 3 billion people in the world who are online today. That's not too far off the entire world's population. This is including developing nations in Southeast Asia or Africa or South America. In many ways, the people of those nations will be better off because their infrastructure will leapfrog a lot of what we've put out in the Western world. Most of the world's experience of the internet will not involve a landline, it will be via mobile. And it will be at slower speeds than what we might be getting on the National Broadband Network, but it represents a very, very different model of adaptation. So of course it is happening to everyone. There is hardly a person in Australia who is not in some way touched by this digital revolution that we are currently living through. And as I indicated, it's happening to everybody at the same time. And this is critical, because as a business owner, you cannot wait to work with the internet. You cannot wait for the NBN before you start thinking about planning for it. Because those people who've got the NBN already are now your competitors. And if they're working and thinking about what their digital future is, and you're sitting back and waiting for yours, then you're not going to be in the box seat when these things finally do get plugged in. Planning is essential, and even if you can't do everything today that you'd like to be able to do, there's a hell of a lot that you can do. And when the NBN does start rolling out, there'll be a hell of a lot more. But if you've not thought about it, you're already putting yourself behind. And you could wind up like these guys. You heard Peter talking about Kodak. Well, Kodak going down, you know, from one perspective, it's a bit funny that these guys actually invented the digital camera that ended up killing them off. But when Kodak went down, it did away with film, which did away with these guys. And I took a walk through Dubbo yesterday, and I suspect there's probably something similar out there, a Kodak Express or similar, operating on the main street in Dubbo today, but there'll be fewer of them now than there were 10 years back. And when each of us were buying our friends and loved one digital cameras, we didn't really realise that the impact of that activity was going to drive the entire portion of the retail market pretty much out of existence. Those guys that do still make money out of processing film probably only do so because they're doing very, very specialist services, or they're running classes, or they're selling cameras, or they're doing other things that have enabled their businesses to evolve and adapt. And this is why you need to be thinking about your digital strategy now, because adaptation starts today. It doesn't start at some future point in time. You've already got fair warning of the changes that are coming, so it's important that you start taking that warning to heart today. Because, sorry, I've gone one too far there. There we go. I don't know if you had one of these out in Borders, out in Dubbo, sorry, this is Borders. This was one of the world's largest book retailers that collapsed about a year ago now. Now, they saw what was coming because people started buying e-books, people started buying from Amazon and so forth, but they still weren't able to put themselves in a position to be able to do something about it. And when this company collapsed in the US, it took 20,000 jobs down with it. And it's not the first. We've seen a lot of US retailers collapse over the last 5 years as they've had to compete with online sellers, and it certainly won't be the last. And when I look at some of the major retailers in Australia today that are struggling with online retail, I do ask myself the question, how long are they going to stick around? Because what we're seeing the internet doing is essentially tearing down walls. It's tearing down barriers. 20 years ago, the books that were available to you to purchase in the Orana region would have been somewhat limited to those that were carried in the bookstores that existed here. Now, you just go to Amazon. And these barriers are being ripped down across industry after industry after industry. And this is why I called my presentation Welcome to the Middle of Everywhere. Because once you move to the digital economy, nowhere is the middle of nowhere anymore. Because all of the services that are available to me in Sydney or Melbourne or any other part of the world are equally available